Hello everybody. Thank you all for coming for the final lecture of the first year of our Symposium of Aristotelian Studies. I'm Professor Daniel Simão Nascimento, the organizer of the symposium, the host for this meeting. As usual, I'd like to thank FAPERJ, CAPES for the financial support, and the members of the research group Pragmousia and Polyphonia for their academic support. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, let me brief you quickly on our protocol. The lecture will be delivered in full, then we'll have a round of questions from our debaters before moving on to any questions from the audience. In order to avoid any possible technical problems, I'll ask everybody but the lecturer to keep their cameras and microphones turned off during the presentation. And if you have any questions, that you do not only raise your hand, but also say so in the chat, so I can keep up with those who is supposed to go first. So speaking of the chat, let me not forget to remind everybody that the handout for the session is there, and that those of you who need certificates should fill in the form that is also available in there. I'll make it available again, just to make sure that those who got late can see it. So I'm sure you all agree, it would be hard to even think of a better closing for the first year of our symposium. Today we're joined by Professor David Charles, who is delivering a lecture. And to debate his lecture, we have Professor Lucas Angione, Breno Zupolini, Roberto Grasso, Mariska Leonesen, and Diana Quarantotto. Professor Jennifer Whiting and Sophia Conan said they will try to be here, so we're hoping they can show up. So let me briefly thank them all for joining us today, and without any more delay, welcome Professor Charles to our Symposium of Aristotelian Studies. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniel. It's always a great pleasure for me to come to Rio or to Brazil, although this time, I think for the first time, I'm not reading a paper either on the analytics or on the metaphysics. I've been extremely impressed by the growth of Aristotelian studies in Brazil over the last 10 or 15 years. Several of its leading proponents are in the room today. As David Bronstein said in his talk, which I overheard, which I listened to, Brazil is one of the few places where you can say per se to predication and be absolutely certain you'll be immediately understood. So that's a great merit of life in Brazil. And also Brazil is a country which I have strong personal connections of a long-standing nature. However, today my talk is going to be on acrasia, one of my old and first loves in philosophy. And what I want to do is to talk about this topic, taking as a starting point work of the last 10 years or so, work which shares a number of assumptions, which have proved, I think, quite difficult to hold together. If you look at the history of Aristotelian discussion of acrasia, going back to the Middle Ages and before, the dominant tradition has been to see Aristotle's account of acrasia in Book 7 of the Ethics as some kind of intellectual failure. Either the acrates is unaware that it's a sweet they're eating, they think don't eat sweets, or somehow they don't use the knowledge this is a sweet to arrive at the conclusion, don't taste this. That is a tradition which I associate with Aquinas and many who followed him after, which is a tradition which Aristotle has pointed out survived through the Middle Ages and came into analytical philosophy as an assumption. There was always a minority party going back to the Middle Ages, led, I think, by Walter Burley, the Oxford Merton philosopher of the 13th century, who held, in the face of strong opposition from the Thomists, that at least one Aristotelian acrates, the weak acrates, got to the conclusion of the good syllogism, said, while tasting the sweet, I should not taste this, in some sense was committed to that, while nonetheless tasting it. Burley had the advantage over Thomas of, first of all, reading Greek, and secondly, having worked on De Motu Animalia. He was the first, probably major commentator in the West on De Motu. And my comments today are within the Burley tradition, what I suppose the minority tradition. So I want to take my background assumptions, 4 assumptions about the correct account of Aristotle's discussion of acrasia incontinence in the Ethics. First, I'm going to take the Burleyan assumption that the final proposition, which the acrates doesn't fully grasp in some sense, is the conclusion. So I read the quotation: since the final proposition, protasis, is a belief about a perceptible, and in charge of actions, this either the person in the passion of acrasia does not have, or has it so that the way of having it is knowledge, epistasthai, but saying, as the drunk says the verses of Empedocles, or has the verses of Empedocles. So I'm going to assume, for the sake of argument, that the final proposition here is a protasis and refers to the conclusion. Paolo Crivelli and I have argued in a work that I refer to in the bibliography that there's a good Aristotelian use of protasis to refer to proposition when it can be used to refer to the conclusion in other contexts. So that argument in favor of the Thomist view, namely protasis always means premise, so can't mean proposition, is undermined. Secondly, I'm going to assume that Aristotle's account of acrasia is not what might be called the simple-minded Humean account, in which on the one side you have belief or knowledge of what is the right thing to do, ranged against desire, where desire in some sense overtakes or swamps knowledge. But rather, the failure of the acrates is in some way a failure of knowledge, or rather a failure of belief. So when Aristotle says, since the final proposition is a belief about a perceptible and in charge of actions, this either the person doesn't have, he means to imply that the final proposition, that the person in the passion doesn't have the belief about the perceptible, which is in charge of actions. So there's a double failure. There's a failure to have a belief about the perceptible and a consequent failure for that to control action. It's not just it doesn't control action as on the Humean picture, but also there's a failure on the doxastic or epistemic side. And for the purposes of this argument, I'm going to treat belief or doxa and knowledge as interchangeable. Aristotle says in this chapter, the difference between knowledge and belief isn't going to be relevant to our present account. Second, I'm going to take the notion of belief here, or doxa, I mean, whether that's doxa or belief, opinion, in the Aristotelian sense. Set out, I think, in Dianima, in my second quotation, where belief involves conviction, pistis, so sometimes called confidence or rational confidence. You can't have belief without confidence. And animals lack conviction, lack rational confidence, but have imagination, but not belief. Conviction attends every belief, and conviction attends being convinced, and being convinced attends having a reason, logos. So the pistis in this question, in this case, the person, as it were, fails to have a belief, means that they fail to have, they fail to hold a claim to which they're rationally convinced. They have it without conviction. And Aristotle notes elsewhere, like in the topics, you can have a hypolepsis, you can grasp something, but still not believe it, because in those cases you may lack conviction. And the project of today's paper really is to try to understand what lacking conviction amounts to. My third assumption, shared by the writers I'm going to talk about, is that the drunk in question is what might be called the tipsy drunk, the lightly drunk. Greek, as you know, has a whole number of words talking about drunkenness, as I suppose befits a symposiastic society. But oinomenos, the word used here, is the word sometimes used to describe the young who are enthusiastic, upbeat, lightly drunk, as opposed to methoon, dead drunk. In Philo's interesting description of drunkenness, he says the person who's dead drunk is incapable of walking straight, incapable of speech, incapable of sex, opposed to the person who's tipsy drunk who has none of those problems. And notes that Philip of Macedon, when he went into battle, was oinomenos. He had a few drinks before he started, but you can bet your life he wasn't dead drunk when he got on his horse or got into the fight. And I'm also going to assume there are two types of acrates: a weak acrates, who on this view gets to the conclusion but lacks conviction in it, and an impetuous acrates who in some way fails to get to the conclusion. So I'm going to take those assumptions for granted. I and others have argued for them elsewhere. They're not universally shared. They're based, I suppose, on the assumption, as Daniel has pointed out to me, that the acratic intentionally eats the sweet or has the drink, knowing what they're doing, so is aware of the minor premise, this is a drink, when they act in taking the extra drink, or aware this is a cake when they take the extra cake. This is, I suppose, the stage which I think debate got to in about 2008, 2010, partly through some of my work and the work of others, including Jennifer Whiting and Martin Pickaway. I want to contrast now two ways of understanding the situation of the weak acrates, the one who gets to the conclusion but doesn't believe it. I want to contrast two different approaches with what I will call the generally intellectualist line of interpretation. By intellectualism, I mean the following view, that in ethical judgment, the canonical factor is seeing or believing or knowing what is good, or what is fine, what is advantageous or advantageous. Intellectual states defined in their own right, without any reference to desire, may control desire and subsequent behavior. But the kind of seeing or believing or knowing in question is a kind which can be found outside value or action contexts. It's, as it were, a kind of seeing or believing which I'm going to call a purely intellectual form of seeing or believing, of the kind which is involved in reasoning, which can be found in reasoning outside the practical sphere. So within this broad camp of intellectualism, there are various species, but I'm going to focus particularly on the species which is closest to my view, but is distant from it, namely the idea that put forward by Tom Nagel and I think followed by John McDowell, that there's a kind of seeing or believing which is attended necessarily by desire. So the desire is defined in terms of being consequent on perception or believing, but the kind of seeing or believing itself can be defined without reference to desire. It is in its nature cognitive in the sense of not so defined, not in any way as conative. There's no conative admixture in the definition of seeing or believing, even though desiring may follow from such states, from such intellectual states. Within this camp, then, the kind of failure which will be brought about by desire, kind of intellectual failure, will lead to acratic action, will be of the same kind as is found in intellectual reasoning potentially. So failure to draw an entailed conclusion, lack of intellectual attention, failure of belief because of lack of appropriate evidential support, doubts about the truth of the claims, and possibly self-deception, taking these to be purely intellectual failures which can happen outside the connection, outside any connection with action, or indeed value. I want to contrast two ways in which people have developed an intellectualist approach. Okay. Can we roll the page down slightly down? Yeah. So I've defined intellectualism, and in a moment, after a while, I'll define my own position, which I call Inextricableism, or the third way. I think there are two varieties of intellectualist account. One developed in an excellent article by Jessica Moss, what I'm going to call the complete shutdown view. In the case of the acrates, there's a complete shutdown prior to action on the good side of the syllogism. Sleep or passion cover over nous. So maybe, as it were, at some point in the past, the weak acrates have got to the conclusion, don't taste this, but they don't have it before them when the time for action comes. There's a sleep of reason. Passion has covered over reason, and there's no reason, as well, there's no judgment present to them at the time of action. It covers over the whole good syllogism. Sweet things are to be avoided. This is sweet, so this is to be avoided. Now, my view is that this view is quite a good description, or a possible description, of one kind of impetuous agent, possibly. But it fails to do justice to Aristotle's description in 7.3 and elsewhere of the kind of acrates I'm most interested in, who is described as saying, flee this, in the present, while desire leads. So it looks as though at one and the same moment, the person says, flee this, and desire leads them away. And secondly, the sleep has to be partial because Aristotle insists that universal knowledge isn't affected in the case of acrasia. He says, since the final term isn't universal and isn't taken to be knowable in the way in which what is universal is known, it actually looks as if what Socrates was searching for turns out to be correct. For the passion doesn't occur in the immediate presence, parousis, of what is taken to be knowledge in its most basic sense, nor is the latter dragged about by passion, but in the immediate presence of perceptual knowledge. And this sure makes it look as though at the moment of action, there's no difficulty or no problem with regard to universal knowledge, knowledge of the major premise, as people say. There's some failure of grasp of the final term or perceptual knowledge, and I'll come back to that. And third, Aristotle seems to be clear in this passage that there's conflict in the case of the acratic. Not, as it were, the tide goes in and the tide goes out. Their judgments change with time. But at the very moment of action, there's a conflict between desire and the better part of their judgment. That's why he says one proposition, well, at least one feminine object, says avoid this while sensual desire leads us astray. So it seems to me that although Jessica Moss gives very interesting descriptions based on de memoria, which I'll turn to in a moment, of what goes on in one case of acrasia, it's hard to reconcile this with the description of the way in which passion leads age, the person with a good judgment, away from that judgment in the canonical description in 7.3. One proposition says to avoid this, while sensual desire leads us astray, and there's conflict between different parts of the person's motivation. So basically, I'm going to accept Jessica Moss's account as an account of the impetuous acrates, pending further discussion, but suggest that it's inadequate as an account of the weak acrates. There's a further attempt by Josef Muller, in a number of also very good articles, to offer an alternative account of an intellectual failure, what I call the partial shutdown view. On this view, the weak acrates gets to the conclusion, but doesn't see it as entailed by the premises at the moment of action. The acrates doesn't grasp the reason why they should so act. Now, this, of course, gets to failure in the right place with regard to the conclusion and can leave the major premise untouched by the onset of acrasia. So it seems to be a more promising approach if you think one actor gets to the good conclusion, holds it to the time of action, doesn't act on it. But I think there are several difficulties. One is that it appears that one acrate actually gets to the conclusion via the activity of the minor premise. That's the person who says, don't do this. So they appear to draw the conclusion from all so-and-sos are to be avoided, this is a so-and-so, this is to be avoided, and to get to that conclusion on the basis of that premise, the premise that all such things are to be avoided, and this is a so-and-so. Secondly, this account attributes to the acrates an extreme form of irrationality. It appears that they know P, the major premise, they know P implies the conclusion, they put these claims together, but instead of knowing Q, they merely say Q without knowledge. So this is an equivalent to denying that knowledge is closed under logical entailment, as we say. And the difficulty is that Aristotle seems himself to be committed to a version of this claim that knowledge is closed under logical entailment in the Analytics, going back to the love of many of us here, with regard to intellectual knowledge. You can know all mules are sterile and this is a mule, but still think this mule is fertile, but only if you don't join together the major and the minor premise to arrive at the conclusion. Muller's view requires one to not merely know the major and minor and join them and arrive at the conclusion, knowing the first two premises, but in doing so also fail to know the conclusion. And that seems an extreme form of irrationality to attribute on this basis. So first of all, I'm arguing there's not really a partial shutdown in this sense. The person gets to the conclusion, and there's no reason to see it as being detached from the mode in this way from the premises. And that if he were to do so, Aristotle would need to show there was some limitation on his principle in the analytics, which he doesn't seem to be doing here. My third worry about this approach is this, that desire is invoked to subvert intellectual confidence or intellectual conviction in the judgment as an external player brought in from outside. So desire is laser targeted at intellectual confidence in the conclusion and does so by subverting intellectual confidence in the grounds. But we have no reason to understand how that happens. It's like having a subterranean actor which pops up at just the right time to produce the failure in question. So I rather agree with Jessica Moss's characterization of this position, that it's clearly a possible position, although one with costs, but there's no real evidence of Aristotle adopting it. As well, this seems like a radical solution to pin on to pages of the text without any clear evidence for doing so. Well, I'll skip over to one or two possible replies to that. So one might think at this stage that looking at the work of, I've talked mainly about Jessica Moss and Josef Müller, but also Hendrik Lawrence's paper, as an attempt to spell out the Burley view that a person gets to the conclusion who's a weak acratic and doesn't act, we haven't got so far in spelling out a coherent story in which that could occur. And indeed, at this point, those who follow the orthodox Thomist view might think that just shows that this kind of approach is mistaken. There's no way of coherently describing within Aristotelian terms what's meant to be going on in this case, or showing what the lack of conviction in the conclusion amounts to. I should say that through the work of Anthony Price, it turns out that the minority party has had a recent late addition in the doughty figure of John Austin, who also apparently took the view in lectures which Price has recently uncovered, that one acrates gets to the good conclusion and doesn't act. Austin talks about this as a failure of subsumptive reasoning, and possibly that's in the right ballpark. But what we want to know is, what kind of failure of subsumptive reasoning is it that characterizes the acrates? And I take it the partial and complete lockdown views are attempts to articulate that, which I've been questioning. Let's stand back for a moment and think, what are the desiderata for an account of the kind we're looking for? We want to specify the weak acrates' lack of grasp on the good conclusion. So that's connected in an explanatory, comprehensible way with sensual desire. Issues in a plausible description of the condition of the acrates, who's described as failing to grasp the final term, using the resources of the chapter earlier. And coheres with the distinction between the weak and the impetuous acrates, and as Jessica Moss has emphasized, is of a piece with what he says about various kinds of failure of memory and knowledge elsewhere. Before passing on, I should note that one of the descriptions earlier in the chapter, the description of the young or first learners, is very, I think, interesting. They're said to say words which come from authority, the authority of their teacher, presumably. I take it to be able to run through proofs based on what they've been taught excellently, but it's said to say the words and not to have confidence in them. To say the words, not to have confidence in them. And that's kind of like an interesting description of, in some way, if only we can understand how it works, of the condition of the weak acrates. They say words which come from a source of knowledge, but don't at the time know them because they lack conviction. So that's a very interesting example, but it can't be a completely accurate example to account for the precise condition of the weak acrates. Because the young students in question don't have a proper grasp on the major premises, I take it. They're like the people in book 6 who are said to take over the starting points and to say them, but lack confidence because they're not based on experience. Well, the position of the acrates must be different in that their grasp on the major premise must be okay, otherwise they'd be self-indulgent or not properly within the ethical domain at all. So unlike the young learners, they must have a good grasp on the major premise, and the acratic failure strikes lower, strikes at the perceptual, at the knowledge of the final term. So even if they say in the end words which come from knowledge, the knowledge is theirs and not that of an alien teacher, they've just internalized. Interestingly, one of the phrases also in that phrase is hypokrinomenos, often translated actors, but can often be used also in Greek for people who make party political speeches, taking over a party political line from somewhere else and just mouthing it, as we say in English, just repeating the words without themselves having internalized the premises. So what I'm going to do now is to operate within a somewhat different framework. What I'm calling framework of inextricableism, or sometimes I used to call the third way. But I've given over, I've stopped talking about the third way as that's become such a discredited political label. Can you go slide down the page, Daniel? Is that possible? Okay, well, what I mean by inextricableism, perhaps this isn't on the handout, but it should be, is this, that one can't define the kind of seeing or believing involved in these cases without essential reference in the definition of that kind of seeing to desire or some conative state, and one can't define the kind of conative state involved without reference to desire. So in talking of seeing something as attractive or as beautiful, one's not merely noting that the person sees it in a given way and desire follows or attraction follows, but this is a kind of seeing which is essentially in its nature involves being attracted to the object. That's the kind of seeing it is. There's no defining the kind of believing or confidence involved without reference to desire. It's a desire involving, essentially desire involving form of seeing or perceiving, not in the sense that desire follows intellectual perception or persuasion, but rather one can't characterize the kind of seeing or the kind of persuasion that is without reference to desire. I want to focus my remarks on perceptual knowledge, understood as practical knowledge of particulars. And I've given a quotation in the handout. It's clear that practical knowledge isn't knowledge, which is the final term which concerns particulars. As has been said, for what is to be done is the latter type. What is done is the latter type. Practical wisdom is about the final term of which there is perception and not knowledge. And the final term, as friends of the analytics know, with the last term introduced in the syllogism and can appear in both the minor premise and the conclusion. So all A is a B, this is a B, so this is an A, the this would refer to the final term, which can show up in both the minor premise and the conclusion. I want to give some arguments, some reasons in favor of thinking of practical knowledge as a distinctive kind of knowledge, which is in its very nature desire involving. And I've argued for this elsewhere in more detail, so I'm just going to give you, as it were, a kind of background picture here. As it all says about practical knowledge, there's the kind of knowledge you can't forget. It's not simply an opinion. So why is practical knowledge non-forgettable? Well, I favor the view which Ryle himself took earlier, that this is because the kind of knowledge practical knowledge is essentially desire involving. And desire is not the kind of thing which one forgets. It may go away, but it's not something which can be forgotten. It's a distinctive kind of knowledge which involves being attracted to an object, and so not vulnerable to forgetting in the same way in which intellectual states are vulnerable to forgetting. And more generally, thinking of truthfulness, as it were, the goal of practical reason as a unified emotional rational conviction. And I've argued for this in one of the articles referred to on the handle in bibliography in the Feshrift for Terry Owen and Gail Fine. On my view, this is why Aristotle concludes his discussion of preferential choice for hieresis at this point by saying, this is why preferential choice is either desiderative intellect or intellectual desire. You can see it as a kind of intellect, but desiderative intellect, or as a kind of desire, namely intellectual desire. This is the type of controller a human being is. But the desiderative intellect or intellectual desire is a way of pointing to a state which is a third way, inextricable state, not decomposable into desire and intellect. In definition. I should add here that I'm operating with strictly Aristotelian influence, as it were, by thinking of inextricableism as a claim that states are not decomposable into two separate elements of definition, which are then added together by prosthesis. This is a claim about definition of the kind which says, for example, snubness shouldn't be defined, this is for the cognoscenti, shouldn't be defined in terms of concavity and in the nose, but snubness is a kind of nasal concavity, a special kind of concavity. So for hieresis, preferential choice is a special kind of intellect, desiderative intellect, or intellectual desire. This doesn't mean you can't separate out those two things in thought, but the thought would be misleading in that it wouldn't track separate components of definition. It would be the kind of thought which can lead you into error if you make the mistake, like that of the Platonists, in thinking that your thought tracks independently definable entities. So there's no objection to inextricableism to say, well, I can think of desire, this state as desire, and I can think of it as a kind of belief. Sure, you can. The real question is, can you define it by having those two components joined together? And inextricableism is a denial that one, in Aristotle's view, one can. Sarah Anthony Price's criticisms of my earlier views fail because they don't really take into account the distinction between separability in definition and separability in thought, which I'm sure in Brazil is constantly insisted upon in discussions of these matters. The third point I want to suggest is that we're looking for an analogue of the first learners, who are said in book 6 to lack experience of the relevant objects. And my suggestion is going to be that the case of the weak acrates is one who, in the relevant sense, lacks perceptual knowledge of the final term. What I want to do is try and give an account of what perceptual knowledge of the final term would be within the third way, inextricablest way of thinking. To do justice to Aristotle's remark that Aphrodite is full of wiles, of blandishment, whatever exactly that means, would steal the wits even of those who are thinking intensely. So I'm going to ask two questions. What kind of failure of conviction or lack of experience is it of the final term, and how does Aphrodite or her twin, the goddess of cakes, actually do it? Steal the wits even of those who are thinking intensively. Okay, so I'm going to put forward a few cards and then make a suggestion, basically, in this paper. The first thing to emphasize, it seems to me, is we're thinking about empyrea, as I thought it was in book 6, to see what ethical empyrea amounts to. We all know from the analytics, certainly in Brazil, that the role of memory and of memory is crucial for experience. In the famous analytics passage, 100A5, it's from memory that experience comes. So what is the relevant kind of memory in the ethical case? Well, I'm operating on the assumption that Aristotle remembering is retention of past seeing or past doing. It's not just remembering that I did so-and-so, it's remembering doing it or remembering seeing it. Sometimes called first personal memory, well discussed by Julia Annas in a paper several years ago. So memory isn't just, as it were, I remember that I was in Rio, it's I remember being in Rio, or remembering doing certain things in Rio, or seeing certain people or things in Rio. Not just remembering that I saw them, or even remembering them, but remembering seeing them. There's some way in which the past experience is retained in the memory. And this, I think, is why for Aristotle, certain memory experiences can be pleasant and painful, closely linked to pleasure and pain. So the remembering pleasant things is itself pleasant. That's a very interesting claim. Or remembering past things is itself painful things is itself painful. Because one might think one can remember pleasant things in a detached way. I remember that it was pleasant when I was in Manaus, but I don't remember the pleasures I took in Manaus. But I don't think else was thinking that way. I think he's focusing on the memory of doing things and seeing things with the pleasure and pain involved in doing them. This is why maybe pleasure and pain or memory are so important in ethical training. That those who've tasted the fine are able to build on that experience. The memory of tasting the fine with the pleasures involved in tasting the fine are alive in the present experience. As one might say, the past experience is alive in the present perception, guiding action, as memory and experience can guide action. So memory-based imagination can prepare desire and lead to action in de motu. Or when one is active in respect to perception or imagination, one acts immediately. So the thought might be that on the basis of imagination, particularly memory-based imagination, an animal or we can act directly towards an object based on our experience and our recall of it being pleasant to taste, for example. It's this where the past experience of it being pleasant to taste is alive in my present perception, guiding me towards it. So what I'm suggesting really is that memory in this case is not merely remembering doing something, but essentially involved in remembering doing something, at least in some occasions, is the trauma on the one side or the pleasures of doing it. There's an interesting question as to why in recalling past pleasures, one now experiences pleasure, which I take it is not just the intellectual pleasure of thinking I once had pleasure, but as it were, in some sense you recall the pleasure of doing it. As Proust was meant to allegedly recall the pleasure of being in his grandmother's kitchen on the basis of eating the cake. The past pleasures and pains are alive in the present experience. So my suggestion is, now moving on to the next page, that applying this to the case of acrasia, we have the following picture. It's perceptual knowledge that this is a cake or this is sweet. It's perceptual knowledge of the this that's in question. But the perceptual knowledge isn't merely that this is a sweet or this is a cake, but will in the standard case also involve one's past experiences of eating this or similar cake, this cake or several cakes like it. The past pleasure or pain of doing so would be as it were active in guiding one's action in the present case. Or in other cases, how disgraceful it was, how shameful or how unpleasant it was to do something. That too can be alive in the present experience, guiding you away from doing it. So my suggestion is this, that in one's grasp of the final term, one shouldn't think this is merely grasping this is a sweet, but coming with it, as it were, in perceptual knowledge, the experiences of the past, which can support or which can, in the best case, support your ethical judgment that this is not to be tasted or this is to be tasted. This is not to be tasted. In support of that, one's grip on how bad or shameful, how unpleasant it was in the past to taste it, or in the pleasure case, supporting the claim that acting in this way is a pleasant or is an agreeable thing to do, because one's past experiences of so acting are part of one's formation, part of one's building of one's relevant character in such a way that acting in this way is agreeable to one, becomes, as one might say, one's second nature. You'll see I'm trying to get behind these claims of second nature to try and give some underlying psychological theory to explain what's going on in such cases. At least that's my attempt. So how can this apply to the case of the acrates? What we're trying to understand is in what sense the acrates lacks conviction in the conclusion, this is to be avoided. And this is going to be based, for Aristotle, as well on their failure to have proper perceptual grasp of the final term, the this. So my suggestion is that the failure of conviction or confidence in the conclusion stems from the way in which, in the acratic case, the associations attached to doing this or this kind of action, or this particular, are operate. And they operate in this case by the acrasia is not summoning up, not calling to their defense their recollection of how bad or shameful it was to act in this way. In a special sense, they can say it was shameful to act in this way, it's a bad thing to do, but what they don't have call up to their resource, is the shamefulness or disgracefulness of doing it. They can know it's disgraceful, but aren't convinced of its disgracefulness. This would be the kind of intellectual failure, the intellectual aspect of the failure in the third way state. It's not just they don't have the right desire, but at the crucial moment of action, they don't see the shamefulness or disgracefulness of so acting, or don't see it to the degree required. There can be more subtle versions here, which are questions of degree. So in lacking conviction of this type, they hear these words as if said by an external authority, which in this case, as though from an alien voice, not themselves, they lack the overall conviction required to abstain in the face of the attractions of the moment. Desire attacks conviction in the conclusion by weakening the support it would normally have. Support grounded in one's experiential or perceptual knowledge about the particular which is immediately present. When grass, after all, it's a cake and pleasant, but one doesn't grasp that in the way which I'm characterizing the way of perceptual knowledge or perceptual experience. Well, that's a richer notion than just grasping this is a cake and this is pleasant, but being aware of the pleasures of taking it or the disgracefulness of taking it. So the weak acrasia on this view arrives at a good conclusion, but fails to be convinced in an intellectual desiderative way that this is the right thing to do. They fail to grasp in this way the particular in the final term of the syllogism. So what exactly does this mean? Well, my thought is, that's the hypothesis, the suggestion, that under the influence of pleasure, they don't use some aspect of their experiential knowledge of the particular in question to see the disgracefulness of taking the sweet, even though they may say this is disgraceful. They could, of course, be distracted from thinking of its disgracefulness. That's one possibility. Or it could be its disgracefulness as it were, sedated by the influence of desire or the attractions of the other course. The underlying motivation for this view, I suppose, is the thought that if one thinks of one's grasp of the conclusion in the third way, inextricableist way, as essentially a devolving desire, and one's grasp of the final term in that way, it's just the kind of thing to be open to. The influence of desire-based states, like seeing the disgracefulness of so acting, or seeing the pleasures of another course. There's a kind of common factor, namely they're both third-way states and both involve desire, which explained how Aphrodite, or her sisters, can beguile the wits, even of those who are thinking intently, by blocking or sedating or checking their grasp on the disgracefulness or shamefulness of acting as they do. Since desire is attacking something which is essentially desiderative, there's no necessity to do so in a concealed way. That is, it needn't go underground and somehow interfere with belief, purely intellectually defined, without with the need for some interesting and complex causal story of how that happens. As Aristotle says, this struggle can be overt. One can be aware of the appeals of the bad cause interfering with or messing up one's grasp on how shameful or disgraceful so acting is. This, I think, is how failure of nerve happens in the cases of courage, which aren't our central concern here. So this allows Aristotle to talk of a struggle between different factors which can interact in this overt way. Okay, so what I've been suggesting really is, or making an attempt to understand what lack of conviction with regard to the final term amounts to. And I'm trying to do so by deepening the notion of experiential knowledge of the final term, so as to involve not merely cognition that this is a suite, but also one's experience and anticipation, which I haven't really talked about, of what it would be like to eat it, or what eating something of this kind is like, which involves one's reliving, one might say, the experience of past eatings and how it was with you when you ate them, either good or bad. So the failure of the acrates is a failure to deploy their experiential knowledge and belief about the last term in the case in point. So standing back, what I've been trying to do is to spell out the Burley view in terms of a background Aristotelian psychological theory, and I've given some more references in the paper. Standing back further, you can see that the kind of view in question isn't the Humean view, in which desire as an independent rogue force intervenes and smashes up intellect, or overpowers intellect. There's a weakening of intellect on this picture, because intellect itself is not purely intellectual. It's essentially desire involving in the way I've been trying to explain. One can't characterize what the states are without reference to the kind of seeing, except as a desiderative kind of seeing, as one can't define preferential choice except as a desiderative kind of nous. But it isn't the intellectualist picture either, because the kind of failure in this case is not a purely intellectual failure as I've defined it, or one which follows from a purely intellectual failure. Rather, the kind of confidence in question, which may be like some of the statements about confidence in the rhetoric, I haven't really looked into that, is something which doesn't bifurcate into a purely intellectual and a purely cognitive component. The kind of confidence involved is, in my terminology, inextricably desire involving. So this view can agree that practical intellect leads to action. It can also agree with the Humean that desire can prevent practical intellect leading to action, and the desire is required for action. But it fits those two components together in a way quite different from that favored by the two-component theory. Indeed, there aren't two components at all. Practical intellect leads to action because itself is inextricably desire involving, in the case of preferential choice and other forms of desire, other forms of motivation. So it doesn't bifurcate into the two components with which we are familiar in post-Humean discussion. Indeed, one could finish by seeing this view as a pre-Humean innocence, one which resists the insistence that we either have intellectual states or desire states or some combination of the two, which I think has driven most recent commentators, well, from Greenwood onwards, I guess, in their thinking about practical knowledge. But I've been arguing that it's only if we give up that hypothesis that we can make sense of the view that one weak acrates gets to a good conclusion, can say it, intellectually grasp why they believe it, but still not be properly convinced of it, because they lack the kind of conviction which comes from memory, past experience, with its essential connection to pleasure and pain. Okay, good. So that's my problem and my hypothesis. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the lecture. It's time now for the questions. Everybody can open their cameras if they wish to. We already have Marta Jimenez online to ask the first question. Professor Jimenez joined us a bit late, so I forgot to.
Hi.
Hi.
Anybody
Hi,
else
Marta.
ask questions?
Hi, everybody. Sorry, it's a little imprudent to ask the first question after being late, but I want to be ready to just jump into my child's duties if I hear him in the back. So that's why I wanted to be first. Thank you so much for that paper, David. And I am completely sympathetic to the inextricableism view. It has to be right. I do have a question about the role that you see that you give to empiria in the because you made this claim about how in the practical sphere intellect is desire involving, and that is something that I think that is easy to accept. Now I was wondering whether you want to say the same thing about empiria in the practical sphere. And the reason why I ask this is because I'm obsessed with this passage from Nicomachean Ethics 3:8, the passage where Aristotle talks about the cases of pseudo courage. And there he raises an objection that he thinks is an objection against Socrates. And he says, well, like Socrates was wrong when he thought that knowledge-based, empiria-based knowledge is courage, empiria of the particulars. And then he just like uses that example, the case of the skilled soldiers or the professional soldiers, which what I think that he means there is that there's something missing in that particular kind of empiria. So it might be that empiria, and like there are two ways of dealing with like how to accommodate this for your purposes. One of them is to say that in that passage, when Aristotle is talking about empiria, he's talking about an empiria that is not linked to desire, while empiria in the practical sphere would be linked to desire. But we also could say that, and I think that this is the view that I was adopting. I don't know how you that naked empiria is not sufficient either for that kind of conviction. And I think that in your paper, there is a moment in which this kind of like this tension is present. That is in your section 6 when you talk about perceptual knowledge. So in the one hand, perceptual knowledge is a knowledge of particular, practical knowledge of particulars. The next point is that it's a distinctive kind of knowledge that there you characterize as linked to emotional, rational conviction. And that part, the emotional, the emotional rational duo is something that is not necessarily present in the empiria bit. So like then like your third point moves to talk about empiria, but it might be that that experience alone is not going to be enough. So well, I think that if the question is clear, I want to leave it there because I don't want to make it more complicated. But the question is like, how do you see empiria? Is empiria always involved in desire? Are two different kinds of empiria? Yeah.
Should I try to reply to that, Daniel? How do we proceed?
Thank you,
Marta. That's a very interesting question, and I haven't really focused on the 3:8 passage, so that's what I definitely need to think about. But straight off, two things occurred to me. I was suggesting that ethical empiria was a distinctive kind of empiria, as you were suggesting. So it seems to me there are two possibilities regarding the passage you mentioned. One is he's using empiria in a kind of quasi-quote way. That is, he's talking about empiria as Socrates meant it. So I was thinking that Socrates may himself have thought, I mean, I take it, my background assumption is that Socrates is really an intellectualist and not an inextricableist. So that one can argue that, as it were, empiria as Socrates intended it, as it were, has these shortcomings. But that's consistent with thinking that empiria properly understood, as it would, or the kind of empiria of the phronimos, of the practically wise person, wouldn't be subject to these concerns. So that's my initial reaction. But look, it may be more complicated than that. And one other move to consider would be this. I'm not sure this works or not. Tell me what you think. One move would be to say, well, look, there can be if you like, differences in extent or range of empiria. So the trained soldier or the trained sports person may know very well how to handle certain conditions, certain particular situations, and their past experience and what it was like doing it could also be pretty relevant to that. So you know how to handle certain kinds of situations. But in other cases, you're just out of your depth because you don't have that kind of experience to fall back on. So that I suppose, and then the interesting question, interesting question then would be to try to say more clearly how you can achieve wide-ranging empiria, not as it were domain-limited empiria. And that's a very interesting question, actually. I mean, if you're trying to prosecute that, one thing you might say is this, that domain-specific empiria is to do with how to behave in particular contexts. If your empiria is, in some sense, let's say, fine or Calon sensitive, as it were, it might have an ability to extend beyond the cases you considered, so that there'd be, as it were, the failure of the soldier would be manifested in two places. One is the lack of range of their empiria, but that would be because of lack of proper grasp on the goal. I mean, that would be another more interesting line to pursue. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's great. I mean, like the passage of 3.8 is, I think, that the main passage to think about this. And I'm obsessed with it because like it's like water for my mill, in the sense that he's distinguishing between the person that has mere empiria and the person who has a sense of shame. I kind of like he compares the one to one another. He says that the soldier with sense of shame is going to be able to kind of like call up that sense of the aiskron, like the shamefulness of the action, and be moved by it, while the person with mere empiria is not going to be able to do that, because it ultimately doesn't truly grasp the fact that doing something shameful is worse than death. So that's kind of like how he closes that passage. And in that sense, like this notion that you're using of the Calon sensitive empiria is beautiful. It might be just like what is implicit in that distinction, but I think that in that particular passage, he doesn't get there. He just and it might be because of the dialectic that he's responding to Socrates, that he just like makes that distinction between having a sense of shame and having empiria, and those two things having different roles. But like the role of like a shame sensitive empiria would, I mean, like a Calon sensitive empiria would do the job, of course. Yeah. No,
but I quite take your point. So it may well be that the first answer I gave may be relevant just to this particular context in 3.8, as it were, of quasi-quoting Socratic notion of empiria. And it's that notion of empiria he's thinking to be inadequate. At least that's what I'd say straight off.
Thank you, that's good.
Thank you for your question.
So now we have Mariska, Diana, Lucas, and then Roberto. Mariska, please.
Okay, thank you, David. Very nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too.
So this is sort of a cluster of questions. I think I'm mostly still trying to grasp what exactly your solution is. So what I'm wondering, like, what causes this kind of mistake of perceptual knowledge, right? So if the acrates is somebody who's somehow flawed, like what is it? Is it something went wrong in their habituation, that they don't have the right kind of experience to back up this way of reasoning? How is it that virtue would fix this? Or how is it the virtuous person didn't end up in this particular state? And then sort of a side question. So like the things, so the way this solution unfolds, I'm wondering if this would also help to make sense of what's going on with women and their, if this is like the best solution I've seen so far of, so they're often the picture is kind of like, well, women are just uncontrolled, their desire is too strong, and it has the kind of Moss picture where it's sort of desire overrules or covers reason. And that doesn't seem to be the case, given that Aristotle characterizes women as having no, basically as being passive, slavish, lazy, and not having a lot of thumos, and this idea that something goes wrong with the conviction, and that lack of conviction originates in the way they see things is kind of an interesting suggestion. So I'm wondering, right, so if we could flesh out.
I understand, yeah.
Yeah.
No, thank you. The second is an extremely interesting suggestion. I mean, people have often taken these remarks, haven't they, about women's speech lacking conviction. I think the word's actually used. The kind of social comment, as it were, on when women speak and no one listens to them. Yeah. But this would be a much more interesting way to develop the idea, as it were, that there's something about the way in which they're trained, I suppose, or brought up, which might mean that a certain group finds it difficult to be convinced in the right way of the claims they make. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a fascinating idea, Mariska. That's
what's your idea?
No, that's your idea. Yeah. I mean, there's a real research project there for someone. No, I think that's really fascinating. I mean, I think quite a lot of these, as you know better than anybody, quite a lot of these discussions of women, for example, are not properly integrated into the psychological machinery. Mm-hmm. Around De Memoria, De Insomniis. So it would be, it's pretty plausible to think, as it were, that those are the resources to look to for trying to tell a fuller story here, actually. Great, okay, well that's, now on the first question, how did it happen? Well, look, let me make a few moves, which you'll probably think are inadequate. So I think one is, it's important to separate the virtuous and the self-controlled in this area. So I take it that I was thinking like this, that the virtuous taste the fineness of acting in a given way, and can recall that the pleasure of so acting or the fineness of so acting as part of their nature when they do so act in the future. And they'll also be aware of the disgracefulness of not acting in this way. So there's where I have a double hit. And that's why it's so firmly entrenched in their nature. As it were, that unlike the Encrates, if they were to take the worst course, they'd feel disgusted with themselves. Yeah. While the Encrates, by contrast, maybe doesn't feel the fineness of so acting, but can feel the disgracefulness of acting in a different way. So thinking of the Acrates as a failed Encrates, or something closer to the Encrates, no, that's not quite right. So thinking of the Acrates as closer to the Encrates than the virtuous person, which I think it must be correct. The thought would be then that at the crucial moment, the disgracefulness of so acting, even if they know it's disgraceful, the disgracefulness of so acting isn't borne in on them. Now, then the question is, how does that happen? As it were, what's the explanation of that occurrence? Now, I think Aristotle's quite cautious. I think what he's trying to do is to set the machinery in place rather than spelling it. But look, what I was trying to do with the stuff about Aphrodite was the idea that Aphrodite can steal the wit in the sense of undermining one's sense of the disgracefulness of so acting. So by focusing on the pleasure, you're either blind to or the disgracefulness, or the disgracefulness in some way sedated or muted. When people say, I may live to regret this, that's one thing, right? But it's quite different doing it while actively regretting it in this relevant sense. So I was thinking that the Acrates could think, well, maybe I'll live to regret this. But what they wouldn't do would be, as it were, their actions wouldn't be permeated by the disgracefulness of so acting. Now, if you ask, how is it that the activity of desire can sedate or distract from the disgracefulness of so acting? I don't think Aristotle really has a psychological theory to explain that. I mean, that's a very complicated matter to spell out a whole story there. My only move was to say, if these are both third-way states, both desire involving, you can see how they can interfere with one another. Unlike the desire versus belief model, where you have to dream up some causal connection between desire and belief, either subterranean or overt. So I think there's a gap in the picture in terms of giving a full account of the actual mechanism, if you like. But I don't think Aristotle's really engaged at that level of detail in the story, provided he can, as it were, kind of give enough, well, I don't know. My thought is, provided he can give enough resources, as it were, to make it a kind of intelligible phenomenon, then the physiologists can tell you, as he says, what the precise mechanism, I don't mean the level of physiology, but as it were, there can be a closer study of the fussis of the phenomenon. But that's below the level of the inquiry here, anyway. So it's in a sense an inadequate answer, but I want to contrast it with another view, which is that he thinks that no explanation is possible, that it's essentially absurd, as Davidson said. And I don't think it's like that. I think it's more that it's incomplete explanation, and you can go and fill it out with an empirical science he didn't possess. So I'm afraid my answer is evasive.
But helpful, thank you.
We have now Diana Quarantotto. Welcome to the symposium, Diana.
Thank you. Hi, David. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Diana. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Thanks, David. It's very interesting. I have one question and some thoughts. So the question is again connected to what Mariska already asked. I was wondering. So at a certain point, you claimed, if I understood well, that the acratic doesn't use the experiential knowledge that she has, right? And so I was wondering, what's wrong with her knowledge, her experiential knowledge? So what's
deficient?
Yeah, so what happens in an acratic person? So she has this experiential knowledge, but in that circumstance, she doesn't use it. And in the paper, at a certain point, you claim, or so it seems, that it is because desire intervenes, and so desire blocks somehow the use of the experiential knowledge. But one might ask, well, but in people who are not acratic, even if desire intervenes, then the person is able to use the experiential knowledge. So I was wondering, is the experiential knowledge that the acratic has somehow defective in itself? Or is there something else that prevents her from employing this experiential knowledge? I'm not sure.
Very good. I understand you. Very good. Good. Excellent. Thank you. Good question.
Shall I go on with the?
Let me try and answer that one first.
Okay.
If I can. Yeah. Otherwise, I'll forget. So this is linked to Mariska's question, isn't it? It's another point where the explanation may seem to be inadequate. So you could challenge it.
I am asking this question on my acratic experience of a smoker. So I'm very interested in the reply.
Yes, well, I'm not sure I can help you with the smoking, but let me think. So we might say, why are some people encratic and other people acratic? As it were, why is it that some people are able to not succumb to the attractions of Aphrodite in these contexts, and others are? Or why is it that the encratic still sees and is motivated by the disgracefulness of so acting, while the acratic at the time of action isn't? See, it seems to me to answer that question, which is obviously a real and focused, targeted question, a good question. One would have to know more, and this is perhaps what Mariska was saying too, about what the aspect of making things part of your nature really amounts to. So the thought might be that there's a failure of, well, we might say there's a failure of complete internalization by the acratic, in that he or she their thinking isn't so permeated by the disgracefulness of certain actions as the encratic is, who can resist. Now, these are just terms I'm using here: permeated by, second nature, sum fuernae in the acratic passage, part of their nature. If one really pushes the question and says, okay, well, those are all good terms. Now, what exactly does it come to, right, to talk in this kind of way? Which I take it is what you're asking, and what Mariska's asking, really. I don't think at the level of moral psychology, Aristotle has an answer to those questions. I mean, what he's doing is not just labeling, he's trying to call on real intuitions. But I don't think he has a way of spelling them out in a way which an empirical psychologist would try to spell them out. Or you might have an account of what internalization amounts to, or what does John McDowell call it, being part of your second nature. You know, these are kind of high-level philosophers' phrases to capture something real, but they're not precise descriptive tools. So, I mean, I don't think we should ask too much here. That's not saying the theory is wrong, it's just saying it's incomplete. In the way in which, you know, go and ask the physiologists looks like a gesture towards, you know, look, when people defend the causal theory of perception in the old days, they used to say, you perceive the object, it causes you to see it in the way whichever it is, which is where this lamp causes me to see it. Now, we don't object to the cause of that kind of causal theory by saying, come on, Grice, you've got to spell out, as it were, what the precise mechanisms are for perception in that case, you know, involving light, reflective properties, and so on. As well, that's an argument at a level below the conceptual, well, what they used to call the conceptual level. So I don't think, at least in the ethics, one should look for those terms. And it's interesting, you see, that at least in De Memoria and De Insomniis, the way in which these claims interrelate to character is not always completely spelled out, although Mariska's done a lot of work on this, of course. So there are kind of gaps in the Aristotelian picture. And the question is whether the gaps are so big that it undermines the kind of explanation I'm offering, or whether they're benign, as I was suggesting with the analogy with perception. Does that address your question, Dan, or have I just dodged it?
Oh, thank you, David. Generally, I'm reticent in saying that Aristotle has a gap in his philosophy. So I would like to suggest, but this is only, I mean, you've been studying these things for years. So I'm afraid of saying very stupid things, but still I'll try. So I was wondering this. So since in the ethics, everything is about happiness, right? Everybody's goal is happiness. So by now, it seems that we are tackling acrasia only by focusing on the single action and the value of how much the person feels that action as disgraceful or not, that single action. But perhaps the acratic, perhaps she might be a person that doesn't put that single action or that single value in a bigger frame that would reinforce her behaving in the good way instead of behaving in the bad way. And so her lack of conviction and her inability to use her experiential knowledge also stems from the fact that the bigger picture is not the right one, is not that of the really wise person. And because, and this might be the reason why it hasn't become, all those values have not become part of her nature, because there is not a unitary nature that helps her behaving in the right way. But I'm sorry, I'm not taking too much time.
No, I mean, let me just respond to that. I'm probably blinded by long-term prejudices, so as we're having somebody coming at these topics afresh, it's very helpful. Of course, acrasia is like epilepsy. It's a one-off condition, rather than like dropsy, a permanent state. So that's, but of course, that doesn't mean that there can't be background claims about why certain people are vulnerable to epilepsy and others are not. So you're right, there should be something about the nature of the acrates which explains why they are vulnerable to temptation in a way in which the self-controlled, who must be the point of comparison. The virtuous is too far away. The virtuous, as it were, is preoccupied with the fineness of so acting and the shamefulness of not acting. I take it I'm inclined to the view that the encrates isn't permeated by the fine in the same way as the virtuous, but can be permeated by the disgracefulness of so acting. But your question is, why is it that one character, what makes it true that one character's attitudes are indelibly permeated by shamefulness in the way in which the self-controlled persons might be and the acratics are not? What is it about the education of one, for example, which separates them from the education of the other? Right. So I'm not sure that this goes to the unity of their vision of the good, because their vision of the good could be as unified as that of the encrates, which is good enough to stand up to temptation. So it has to be something about the way in which they've come to experience, I would have thought. And so I've been trying to think like this. Moral education and change of views depends on experience, and experience, as it were, can be so rich in some cases as to permeate, as to making it leave an indelible mark. And this is why characters are formed. In other cases, characters are formed in a less entrenched way. Let's call that the experience first view. Now that could be counterposed with a different view, which was a character-based view, I suppose, where you take as basic in your explanation the fact these are different kinds of character, different kinds of nature. But that doesn't seem very explanatory to me. That's just labeling, as it were. The danger of that view is you're just labeling certain kinds of views as character 1, character 2, character 3. And there's no dynamism in that picture. Unless you invoke, as it were, a lack of unity in the goal. But then I don't see the difference between the encrates and the acrates at that point. No, thank you. That's a very deep question. It's a good question.
Thank you, David.
Lucas, your turn now.
Thank you, Daniel. David, a small question about terminology, David. I wonder whether your view is compatible with taking in the classical passage by the end of chapter 3 of Nicomachean 7, taking eschatos horus there as standing for the last proposition. So the referent will be the same as the teleotaia prothesis, instead of taking it as a term. I think it will be better for you to do this, but it's a big move to do that. So,
again, yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, I'm taking these things in the good old analytics way, Lukáš, of separating the prothesis from the terms in the prothesis. So one thing is quite important, it seems to me, is this, that Aristotle talks in this chapter about tos sumperanthe, not the sumperasma. Now, maybe tos sumperanthe means the thing concluded, like this action, while the sumperasma would be, like in the de motu, would be the whole proposition. Because after all, you do what's been concluded as you do what's been ordered. You don't do the order, which would be like doing the proposition. So I'm holding on to the thread, the distinction, you know, a good old, he's read the analytics, same as you and me. So he has this horos prothesis distinction clearly in mind. He's actually using it here to allow the last term to pick up that thing which is concluded, the this, like in doing this. Well, this is to be done, maybe.
Okay, it is an action. It's not, for instance, it's not the cake, for instance, but it is the action. Okay.
Well, at least in some of the cases, yes. So,
I'm happy with that. So that was the direction of what I have in mind. Actually, I was more worried with the possibility of taking horus for the cake, for instance, instead of taking the cake as eatable under a particular circumstance, or eatable, generating this effect or this kind of pleasure. This is pretty much my worry.
No, I think you're onto something important here. So look, I mean, playing my cards face up. I mean, I was taking the horos in these cases to be this, like avoid sweets. This is a sweet, so avoid this, right? So I was taking this to refer to the cake. You're right about that. Okay. So I can't avail myself of this is to be done straight off. I went too quickly in my first response. So I was thinking that one's grip on the final term, the this, the cake, as it were, shows up both in the minor premise and the conclusion. So one's grip on what it would be like to eat this cake, as it were, is alive both in one's grasp of the minor premise and in one's grasp of the conclusion. So the lack of conviction in the conclusion, as it were, goes together with some kind of lack of conviction in the minor premise. Not, of course, a lack of conviction that this is a sweet, but lack of conviction about the this in question, which shows up in the conclusion, I suppose. Can you help me see the next step here, or am I off on the wrong track, do you think?
Oh, yeah. I'm also worried by the fact that Aristotle calls this horus epistemonic, which is weird. If it's not impossible to understand, but it's a kind of weird to say that a horus is epistemonicon unless the horus stands for proposition. And actually, there is distinction prothesis horus in the analytics as a whole, both in the prior and the posterior. But Aristotle mixed up his own distinction. Lots of times he uses horus meaning not exactly the term, but the term as asserted as predicate in a given sentence of a given subject. So we might even translate horus as proposition or premise in some occurrences of it. So I wonder whether in this case too, in the Nicomachean Ethics, if we take the eschatos horus as the last proposition, that would be better for the whole account, including the account of what this epistemonic means, because people translate it as knowable, but that's not. It doesn't seem too satisfactory to me, because it's not epistaton but epistemonikon, and it has to do with some let's just say some power the proposition has of making us know something relevant in the situation. It's not knowable in this case, but making us know, or having a power, having a cognitive power or something like that. Having a cognitive power in the sense of leading us to know the relevant things. But it's just a small point of terminology.
No, that's a very interesting, very helpful point, and very interesting point. So, I mean, one question around here in this passage, we're talking about 47b, 15 following. Is how far we're operating within kind of a context which is sensitive to Platonic use. So it's not kurios epistemes or dokuses, what's taken to be proper knowledge. So that Aristotle is clearly under some pressure in talking about aestheticae episteme in any event. I mean, this is a pretty odd usage. So my sense is that in a way he's kind of going along with it doesn't matter if you're talking about docs or episteme, let's talk in this slightly loose way here about kinds of knowledge. I think your point about epistemonikos being active rather than open to knowledge is a very interesting point, because I hadn't thought about that. So it would be, it's not universal, nor having the power of knowledge in a way a universal does, right?
Yes, yes.
Or being efficacious with regard to knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
I think the worry would be that, or one worry would be, this is going to be true of one's grasp of the conclusion or the final term in any case. So it might not be distinctive of the acratic case. So one's grasp on the final term or the proposition, in no case will be epistemonikon. That means having the power of episteme strong. So it wouldn't be distinctive of the acratic case. I was taking these remarks here just to be a kind of contextualization of the earlier discussion at the top of the page, as well. This is a way to put that using Platonic terms, if you like.
Okay.
But thank you. That's a very interesting observation, because I need to think more about it.
Okay, thank you.
Roberto, your turn.
Thank you. And thank you, Professor Charles. It was really great to hear such a fine non-intellectualistic account of acrasia. And I'm actually now left wondering, how is it that the intellectualist accounts are so popular? But I don't know, maybe there is some bias there. Anyway, in your talk about memory and personal experience,
yes.
I got the impression, I don't know if it's right or wrong, that it's somehow important that the resource being involved in the final decision is memory, as opposed to any, let's say, fantastic trace of past perceptions. And I would like to hear about that, if it's a right or wrong impression. And I'm interested in this question because, as far as I can remember, for sort of memory is of particulars and particular events. So it's, for example, that caipirinha I had at that bar in Rio in 2000, that night in December 2000 and whatever, 20, okay?
I remember it well, yes.
Okay, so if the resource is memory, I mean, what is important is memory, not just any fantasia. Okay, I would like to know how this memory of some particular event and some particular object can help me with regard to other instances of the same type. So, for example, with any other caipirinha drink or any alcoholic drink anywhere in the future. So this would be my doubt, but I don't know if it's probably I'm getting wrong the emphasis in memory. So it's not like Aristotle's memory or anything like that, but it's just a more modern way of saying fantasia.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very important, interesting question. First of all, your build-up. Why is intellectualism so popular, right? Well, I think people think in the following way. We've only got two alternatives here. We've got desire-based theories, you know, some people like those, and then those who don't like those, like Ross, for example, think the only alternatives are those defined by Hume, and so as it were, plump for the intellectualist picture. And the problem is that this conceptualization, which runs through a great deal of contemporary philosophy, now kind of written in our graduate school training, as it were, blinds one to these non-additive pictures of definition. So it's a kind of atomism. It's either intellect or desire or some combination of the two, where combination means one is added to the other. So I think, for example, John McDowell, is a doughty resistor of Humean theories, which he sees as, hydraulic and crude, mechanistic, and so having got that off his chest, he then plumps for the intellectualist picture without thinking that there's a kind of way of thinking about seeing, which isn't, like seeing a beautiful picture or a beautiful view, which isn't just an intellectual appreciation of its beauty. So I think one good thing about ancient philosophy is it can kind of free you from the mindset which forces us, like slaves or like the prisoners in Fidelia's cave, to go one way or the other. So that would be my general response to that bit. Now, look, on memory more seriously. Thank you. In the paper, I talked a bit about anticipation as well, which is clearly also involved in this discussion by Aristotle. You can anticipate certain things, and that can have an impact on what you now do. So it's not just memory, but the basic frame of your question is this: memories of particulars. Maybe anticipation is also of particulars. Well, maybe, I don't know. But how can memory, which is focused on particulars, have this impact on cases which are not the very one not the very one not the very particular in the past? So look, I mean, the question here really is, how is it that one empyrea comes from many memories? So I'm taking maybe a more cautious formulation would be to talk about the way in which experience, so the doctor can see this case is like that case. So what worked there may work here. Thinking of the empirical doctors and, so maybe I should better talk about experience which is memory-based rather than just memory. I don't know. See, the alternative line would be to say there's a way of thinking about memory for Aristotle, which isn't just, which is memories of how to do things. What Frege called what he called a trail memory or a routine memory, where you remember this is the way to do so and so, as the animal can remember the way home from different directions. So that would be a more ambitious answer to your question. But I agree there's an issue to be faced here as to whether one should say memory is the basis for experience, but experience goes beyond memory, or whether you can, as it were, liberalize memory so that although it's particular based, you can learn, like remembering how to cycle, for example, which is a kind of routine memory or action memory, which Freire thinks is present actually in the discussion of animal memory. Michael Freire thought that. I'm not sure. That would need to be examined more carefully. But you're right. You're right. If one thinks of memory as targeted on particular past episodes, then there's a question of how you invoke that as relevant to the present case. Of course, you could say, that that's just what we're naturally inclined to do. We're the kind of animals who are naturally inclined to see the present in the light of particular past episodes. So why one might like another drink of caipirinha is that just because, as it were, you recall what it was like last time. I'm sorry, I'm slightly flailing to answer your question, but I think it's a very interesting question, which just shows there's more work to be done on the understanding of the precise connection between memory and experience. I think that's consistent with the kind of general framework I'm operating with. But you're right, there's a gap there, and probably one which Aristotle did a bit of work on, if Freire is to be believed.
Thank you. I'm really happy with your answer. I was worried about Aristotle's account of memory, because if you take it on face value, it's very restrictive. So it's very
I understand that. Yeah, don't forget that in the analytic, there's this notion from many memories one experience comes. And in a way, what we're trying, if we were to push on with this, we'd try to investigate how that's meant to happen. Is it from, in the sense of they're causally, temporally antecedent conditions, or is there some way in which the past experience, as it were, forms, the past memory forms the nature of the experience itself?
I see, yeah. Thank you.
No, thank you. It's a good question.
Breno, it's your turn now.
Hi, David.
Hi, Breno.
It's a pleasure to see you again after
Nice to see you again.
Years. Yeah.
You look the same.
Okay. I'm not sure if that's good news or bad news, but thank you. Yes, I was thinking about Joseph Miller's interpretation.
Yes.
Problematic consequence of intellectual knowledge not being closed under logical entailment. And I was wondering whether, in your view, proper practical knowledge is not closed under logical entailment. And by that, I mean that the following: if we think of reasoning or inference not as an ordered set of propositions, but as a psychological process, and deliberation as a sort of inferential psychological process, it isn't part of what is happening with the incontinent, that in the inference he or she performs, there is a failure in the transmission of the motivational strength of the major premise to the conclusion. So we have sort of, even though the agent realizes that the conclusion follows from the premises and is capable of stating the conclusion, nevertheless, the inference is not properly practical, or practica in Greek, that meaning something like productive of action, unless not only the truth is preserved from premises to the conclusion, but the inference as a psychological process is such that the motivational strength of the choice codified in the major premise is transmitted to the conclusion. Is that a fair
yes, absolutely.
representation of your view?
Yes, excellent.
Yeah.
I said with one qualification, Brenner. So I mean, in a way, I'm saying that you could say that practical knowledge isn't closed under logical entailment. The reason I'm not putting it the way you were doing it is that although I used to think in that kind of way, I've rather come to distrust talk of motivational strength as being used as a cavalry in this discussion, as it were,
Yeah.
because although Aristotle does talk about, as it were, excessive desires occasionally, he doesn't look at that's what's really doing the work in this. So that's what I'm trying to get behind that talk, with this getting into the notion of conviction.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of conviction in the complex, in the third way I was suggesting. So you're right. What happens in the case of acrasia is the person is rationally convinced of the major premise. They can be rationally convinced, I suppose. Well, they can be convinced in some ways this is a suite, but they're not rationally convinced of the conclusion. For the virtuous person, of course, they will be rationally convinced, and probably also the self-controlled person will be rationally convinced. But there's a special kind of failure. This is my actual claim. There's a special kind of failure which is available in practical reasoning, which isn't visible in the purely intellectual case, because of the distinctive nature of the conviction involved. So just as you say, that's exactly what I was trying to say. That what I should have said really. That my suggestion is there's a sense in which practical knowledge is not closed under logical entailment because of the nature of the conviction involved. Okay, so we set my position up. Now, what do you have an objection to this?
No, actually, it was more like a clarification question, and I think that's very congenial to what Aristotle says in Book 6, Chapter 2, where practical truth is characterized in terms of the logos being true and the desire being correct. So we can think of practical inferences in terms of a sort of preservation of truth value and the correction of the desire. And I think that makes perfectly good sense in your view, in which the inference is inextricably intellectual and emotional as well. And this is a passage in which practica clearly means, as Lucas always insists in his lectures on the Nicomachean kinetics, that's why I remember that. So practica means what is productive of action, and not only something that is about a practical subject matter. It's practica in the sense of being, in the sense of leading to action, and that requires not only the preservation of truth value, but also the preservation of the correction of the desire. Yeah.
That's very helpful, but we have to be very careful how we state our position here, Brenner, because look, what we don't, what's at issue here really is this. Somebody who's a two-component theorist could say just what you said. As it were, what's important is these two animals march in step, intellect and desire, hand in hand, like we're behind one flag. Well, what I'm trying to suggest really is that practical aletheia, which I understand as truthfulness, as it were, adherence to the truth, like a virtue, as it were, essentially involves practical conviction. And so that doesn't decompose. And that's why he ends up with the, perhaps, as it were, this erectikos nous dianoetike orexis formulation, to try to where the adjectives are capturing it's not orexis plus dianoia, but it's a certain kind of intellect or a certain kind of desire. So, and I had a bash at this in my article in the Erwin Fine Festschrift of trying to spell out this kind of view. 462, But I've had to go elsewhere trying to spell out this view of practical reasoning. But they need to be brought more closely together in the way you're suggesting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're finished with the round from the debaters. Now we have a few questions from the audience. The first is Victor Gonçalves. Victor, you there?
Yeah. Professor Charles, many thanks for your presentation. I have actually two questions. The first one is simpler and more straightforward, and we'll start with it, okay? Well, given your conception of practical experience, I would like to ask a question about the consequence of it. How do you think that that would interfere with the curability of acrasia? Aristotle famously in 7.7, I think, in 1150 B20 and following, talks about a sort of method for curing acrasia, but usually the interpreters take the passage to refer only to impetuosity and not to weakness, right? But perhaps in your account of the specific kind of failure that Wikicratic undergoes, perhaps this also talks about the weakness, since Aristotle talks out about proeidotes, proaistes, perceiving right before, thinking right before. So perhaps you can think about you can call this experience you have, this practical experience you have, in order to prevent acrasia from occurring. Would you concur with that?
Yes, I would. Thank you very much. I would also, we haven't talked much about anticipation, although it's in my paper, as well as thinking of anticipation and memory as, in some sense, symmetrical. So I would very much agree with the line you're pursuing, Victor, and add to it the remark earlier in 50b22, the curious remark, well, those who pro aisthenomenoi kai proedontes proegerantes eautus, those who foresee and look ahead and stir themselves up. And I take it with an example of tickling as used, complex social situation. So yeah, I'm not sure what to make it, but anyway, the idea I take it would be that anticipation, and particularly anticipating what it would be like to do it, and how you'd feel about it if you did it, and subsequently, can be a really important mechanism looking forward and looking back. If you can find a way, picking up the questions that Mariska and Dinah were focusing on, if you can find a way to use memory as a weapon, to weaponize memory, I might say. You remember that bit in the Republic where he describes the oligarch as fighting with diminished forces against a strong opponent? So the question is, can the oligarch summon more allies to the fight? Well, obviously being oligarchy can't say that. But in this case, as it were, you might think you could summon up past memories as an aid in the conflict. So I think you're right that this is where it does suggest, both in the memory way and in the anticipation way, a way in which perceptual knowledge can be can play a role in moral education even late on, and not just in the early stages of do you taste the fine or not. I mean, clearly the third way view has a different picture of moral education than the Bernese picture, which is just you happen to enjoy doing fine actions, that's okay. And the Brody view, which is where is that someone tells you do this kind of action, keep at it, like some school teacher. Because the idea would be that you actually engage with the fineness of so acting in the action itself, and that's why it sticks with you.
Thank you. And the
so
second
no,
question,
can I just underline the correctness of your position, really, or your suggestion?
Thank you. The second question concerns the nature of this practical experience. You said, well, perhaps this, I think this is perhaps connected to habituation. And I'm thinking of some passages in book 6, in 6.6, if I'm not mistaken, and 6.12, where Aristotle talks about people who are corrupted by pleasures, not being able to, the end does not manifest to them. And he says that in 2 instances in book 6 and also in 7.8, where he talks about arete physique etiste being didascalique, about the right principles of action. So perhaps that experience, the problem with the experience of the acratic is perhaps due to habituation. But if that is the case, and this is the problem I'm envisaging, perhaps we don't necessarily need a third way in order to make sense of that as a possible interference for the practical cognition. For Aristotle, at least this is explicit in the Nicomachean Ethics, is also committed to the idea that you can only really grasp claims about the good, namely definitions in ethics, if you were properly educated right before, right? So, and he says explicitly that habituation plays a role that is analogous to experience and induction in the acquisition of the principles in ethics. So perhaps the move he is making in saying that there's a problem with acratic agents is analogous to the move he's making when he says that the proper audience for the ethical treatise is not does not consist of people who has not been properly educated right before. So not being properly habituated, so not taking pleasure in the good, impedes you from believing in claims about the good. So it would work just like induction or experience works in the theoretical science, but we do not necessarily need to be committed to a third way explanation. Perhaps the analogy between practical and theoretical sciences can do the work here. How would you react to that?
Well, I would agree with it, but not in the sense you intend. So look, it won't surprise you to realize, to hear that I have a third way of understanding what grasp of principles amounts to, which explains why sometimes he talks about grasp of principles as hypolepsis, right, as you know, but sometimes as voulesis, as were a kind of desire. And then the commentators of the 19th century, you know, Trendelbaum, all these blokes, as it were, they then wrestle with the question, how do these two components fit together? Is it that desire is a necessary condition for having correct hypolepsis? As it were, does desire in some sense teach you what the correct hypolepsis is? So, now, my suggestion, of course, is that this is a false dichotomy. Namely, that what counts as good habituation with regard to principles is at the same time a kind of being convinced or commitment to those principles, which doesn't bifurcate into intellect plus desire. Now, so that's why this is analogous to what happens in the intellectual case, but it's clearly different from it in some ways. Because I take it that induction in my assumption is that induction in the intellectual case doesn't involve pleasure or pain or experience, as it were, as an essential part of the process and the goal, in the way it seems on the third way picture. So there's clearly a kind of Platonizing view which says you've got to get your desires right. Only when they're right can you do mathematics properly, or can you have a proper grasp of ethics. And that's clearly a very respectable view. But I think it runs my own sense of what it's worth is that runs aground on well, in a number of ways, but in particular in the way of thinking of what's involved in commitment to the principles of in the right way, which isn't just grasping they're true and well supported, but actually making them part of your nature, being engaged with them. I think you also need to explain, you see, look, another question is this: why is it that if you have a good grasp of the goals, in the case of the virtuous person, that's going to supply or inform, help them dealing with internal opponents? Right. Because just having intellectual grasp and being well trained doesn't seem to give you the resources and the nature of the goal itself to deal with internal opponents. And then you get back into the kind of lion tamer picture, where here's the good goal, intellectually grasped, and a sea of opponents, like Kant, a sea of opponents lying around you, with whom the intellectual giant has to do battle. Which, the giant can only be put in place if you have good desires, but once the giant's in place, it single-handed takes on the opponents. And that seems like a very weird picture to me of how Aristotle is proceeding. So look, I mean, you're right. I would raise the stakes slightly in my answer to you by thinking that it's analogous to the role of Empirier with regard to, but not exactly the same.
If I may, just a final point on the analogy. There's perhaps a further point when Aristotle in the Analytics describes the epistemon as debaios kai ametapeiston, right? He is immovable and inexorable in his knowledge. And he says that that is so because he not only believes that the conclusions he has are the right ones, but he also knows that the opposite conclusions are false.
Yes, quite.
And then perhaps habituation is doing just that in ethics, insofar as it removes all these opponents to the right conception of the goal. But if that is the case, then acratic and encratic agents would not really grasp the goal well, and so they don't really have a correct grasp of the goal, and something goes amiss in all their reasoning. And
but look, we agree, don't we? I mean that I was accepting that the self-controlled and the acratic have a different grasp of the goal from the virtuous. And putting that in my terms, that's because, like in book 6.12, the virtues can see the fineness of so acting, i.e., they are taken over by the fineness of the given way of acting. While the self-controlled don't, I take it, since they're not virtues, don't see the fineness. They can tell you it's fine, but they don't have the same kind of grasp on the goal as the virtuous does. They can also, presumably, but I was making a concession to the self-control, namely they can see the disgracefulness of not so acting. Because you need that to keep them on the rails, it seems to me. But look, that's a very interesting line of challenge, Victor. I mean, to try to think through what a sophisticated two-component theorist would say, and they put all their money on correct intellectual grasp of the goal, facilitated by a desiderative process which removes all opponents.
thank you.
That's the real opposition. Thank you.
Constanza, your turn now.
Hi, thank you very much, Professor, for your talk. And actually, I would like to thank you for your whole work. It's been a great inspiration for my researches. And I would like to go back to the beginning of your handout, to the background suppositions, which you've mentioned the use of the passage in the topics in book 4, which is great because people usually only use book 1 to criticize the treatise. And you're talking about the distinction between conviction and truth, which I think it would be a great topic to discuss between Brazil and the US, specifically in the COVID problem. And I was just wondering, how do you see this kind of temporary belief for discussing purposes they have on the type of gayness to be defined in a discussion? And if for the, sorry, I got a bit lost, for the use of like, if we can agree to a concept for discussing purposes, but it would come back to the problem between conviction and truth and belief, but that's a larger discussion. And I'm sorry if I'm being confused. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much. So look, you're right. if I was developing these ideas properly, Constanze, it would be imperative to properly specify the necessary conditions, sufficient conditions for hypolepsis as a genus. And this would be also relevant to the problematic discussion in De Anima 3.3 as to whether fantasia is a kind of hypolepsis or not. So I was only making a first cautious move in that direction by tying doxa to pistis and pistis to logos on the basis of the De Anima passage. Now, there's a really important question, and then saying that you can hypolambane something without being convinced of it, as presumably the young students hypolambane the arguments they use and can grasp the conclusions of those arguments, even though they aren't in the appropriate sense convinced of them. But this falls far short of the proper engagement you're looking for, which would be to say something substantive about what the minimal condition for hypolepsis is. I was just taking that to mean accept as true. As a genus. And I'm inclined to think that even in the fantasia case, that can be accepted as true. But that's obviously, that's a further claim beyond. Yeah. Do you know the answer to this question, or?
Actually, I can, if I can rephrase my question in a more direct one, I would like to ask you if you think that the topics has in itself a purpose of practical reasoning kind of training, as it says in the beginning for one of its uses, for these kind of ethical situations where you have to mix a universal law with a particular case, and you get in the topics that kind of preparing for that experience. I don't know, what do you think about it?
Yeah, that's a question, that's very interesting. I have no real views on that question. I mean, that's a question about what kind of training is the topics a part of? Is it a part of intellectual training in dialectic, or is it also, can it also be seen as some kind of ethical training? I was only relying on the thought that the distinctions it makes have ethical application, rather than engaging with the further question of what the purpose of the topics may be. But I do see, Constanze, there's a certainly interesting line of investigation there, whose conclusion I would be interested to see, but cannot myself at the moment foresee.
Constanze, you satisfied? Yes. So
well, no, I didn't. I declined to answer the question, unfortunately. So,
we have two more questions now. Nevin had left his question, but I think he stayed. But he asked me to read his question, so I'm going to do it. 1 second. Nevin asks the following question. He says, Aristotle provides a story about the explanation of the acratic actions. Meanwhile, he points to the physiologoi for a different physiological explanation. This reminds of On the Soul, where he draws the conclusion that the pathia of the soul are in mattered accounts. He uses anger as an example. So the full explanation includes physical and formal features. Do you think this is correct? And if so, do you think without such a physiological account, the acrasia account provided at Nicomachenes 7 is not full? I can share his question if you would like to read it.
No, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm keen on the ematted accounts as well in the, And of course, I interpret those also in the third way of thinking. You can't say what the psychological aspect is without reference to the material, and the material without reference to the psychological. So I see these two cases as exactly parallel. If you know what I mean. As it were, there are two component theories in both areas. The standard two component theory is desire and belief, or desire and cognition. The standard two component theory in the psychological case is to have the psyche part defined without reference to the body, and the body part defined without reference to the psyche, and the one instantiates the other. So that's a kind of immaterial account, but not the kind of account which someone who's an inextricableist would give. They would say you can't define the psychological aspect in the case of anger other than as a hot, physically involved form of desire for revenge. It's not desire for revenge plus heat, but the heat as where influences or characterizes the kind of desire for revenge anger is. So, you know, it's not desire for revenge, which happens to go together with boiling of the blood, but it's a stressful, intense kind of desire for revenge. I mean, I think of these as both immaterial accounts, although I'm not sure how far in the ethics Aristotle is thinking precisely of the kind of immaterment. These remarks about, that's a topic for another discussion, you know, the concave and the concave and the convex, that's a, you know. But I don't think the reference to the physiologoi means go to the purely physical level. I think that's a maybe a misunderstanding that Robinson and others have left us with. I take it the physiologoi are people who know about the physis, have some detailed knowledge of the physis in question. And that can be filling out of the causal mechanisms in the way that Diana and Mariska were asking for, but in a way which would be, as it were, also psychophysical. It wouldn't be, let's ask the, I mean, God knows what physiologists do these days, but it's not as we're appealing to a purely brain state description, or description purely, it needn't be a description purely in physical terms. We're talking about a physis here, where the physis presumably is goal directed and permeated by teleology. So I think my answer to Nevin's question is yes. I do think the physiological would win. I do think these are immaterial formulae, and I see the analogy he's drawing between the overcoming dualism in the mind-body case as analogous to overcoming dualism in the desire-belief case. Snugness works, as Husserl said, snugness works well in both cases. One shouldn't think of desire for revenge plus the bodily state. It's rather, it's a specific kind of bodily desire for revenge. And you shouldn't think of the body described as what it is without reference to its psychological capacities. It's like weaving in his case. You can't break it down into a psychological bit and a physical bit. You know, weaving is an ongoing process guided by the skill, and probably you can't say what the skill is without reference to the physical process. So I think the analogy is very helpful. It's just I'm a bit skeptical of the use of physiologoi to mean purely physical in our sense. Does that help, Nevin? Maybe he's gone.
No, she actually is here.
Oh, hi, Nevin. Yeah, very good. Hi.
The pronoun. She's here, but I'm not sure.
Thank you for the response. Thank you, Professor.
No, thank you for the question. It's a very, very interesting question, Nevin.
Thank you. It was very helpful. And your remark about physiologoi is quite helpful. I was thinking the other way around. I was thinking in terms of physics rather than
yeah,
physics.
No, I know. And lots of people do that. Really influenced by Richard Robinson, who said this was a trivial answer for physiologists. You know, the main part of the discussion. I mean, it's quite instructive actually to see the influence of these past masters. So that was Robinson's contribution. Cook Wilson, in an earlier period, who was obviously a very, very intelligent reader, if you read his discussion, what he couldn't see, this is going back to Victor's question, really, he couldn't see how the desire part elements of 7.3 fitted together with the belief type elements. So his solution was to carve the chapter up into different layers, some of which were belief-based, some desire-based, like the levels that Schliemann found at Troy. Yeah, as it were, and think that it was just put together by some idiot, as it were, who couldn't, as it were, he had these desire bits and sometimes desire belief bases one time, they were just kind of jumbled together. And Cook Wilson's discovery was to discover the layers. Actually, that's two component thinking really carried through to its logical conclusion. So that's a remark to Victor, basically.
So we have one more question from Dukas. He also left it written. I think it's about the difference between Aristotle's view and Socrates' view. And he says, he thinks that your reconstruction in favor of the possibility of acrasia amounts to an argument that is per se more robust than the other ones you mentioned. And still, and this is not exegetical, does your reconstruction amount to a crippling objection on the Socratic claim? And what he says, what he means is this: isn't it possible that Socrates duly agrees with the objection while still maintaining that what he was denying, was the existence of intellectual plus the extras? That's his expression. Intellectual plus the extras, acrasia all along. Not to be excluded that the dispute is not entirely verbal, that Socrates is implicitly accusing people believing in acrasia, that they validly establish the presence of some form of acrasia in some weak sense, while cashing out their conclusion in the strongest sense.
Yeah, it's really Dukas isn't here. So I'm not completely sure I grasp that. So let me just make 2 points, as it were, to the ether. One is, I take it that the kind of response Aristotle is envisaging from Socrates in this discussion is one which separates knowledge and belief. So you can't act against knowledge, and maybe you can act against belief. And I think Aristotle's response to that is pretty interesting. He says that's not the distinction that's relevant here. So that Socratic move is not in play. Now, I've been inclined to read Aristotle's reading of Socrates in light of the remarks in 612 that Aristotle, Socrates, according to Aristotle, thought of practical knowledge as a kind of episteme, and thought of episteme in an intellectualist way, as I'm characterizing it. So there's one thing, knowledge, which is the very same in the practical and intellectual sphere. So it's not like Brenner was saying, you have the analogy between the two. There's just one thing. And so thinking on that basis of Socrates as an out-and-out intellectualist. And I think my reconstruction really is that although they could agree on the words, as they tend to at the end of 7.3, there's a real disagreement as to the content. So there could be a verbal agreement that perceptual knowledge is dragged around. So, proper knowledge isn't affected. Knowledge universal isn't affected. There's a verbal agreement concealing deep disagreement, rather than verbal disagreement concealing deep agreement, which would be the opposing view. It's a pity Dukas isn't here. I'm sure he has something more to say on that. But anyway, that's how I was taking it. Of course, look, for all we know, for all I know, it may be that Socrates himself, when he talked about knowledge, wasn't completely clear as to what kind of knowledge he was talking about. And that Aristotle was setting him up as an intellectualist. That's also possible. Then you can argue why that was the case. Was it that Socrates wasn't that clear? And that doesn't seem to me at all impossible. And Aristotle was using his standard mechanisms of definition, analysis, to say, well, what Socrates says is kind of more or less right, but you have to be much more careful in setting these terms up. And after all, that's what I'm good at, Aristotle would say, because I've got these resources of sameness and difference in definition, sameness and difference in thought, the kind of analytics tools, as it were, to use. So I'm not sure these debates are always best put in terms of Plato says A, Aristotle says not A. You know, there you go. It seems to me very often it's more that, like often in philosophy, what the person says is more or less true, but they just haven't analyzed it completely. So maybe Socrates himself was veering in this direction. You know, those remarks about different kinds of arche in the Republic, pretty obscure. So maybe Aristotle was kind of saying, well, you know, one possible way to develop Socrates' view would be in the intellectualist direction, and that wouldn't be correct. So that's rather a rambling answer to an important question.
So I guess this was our last question. I'm looking now here in the chats, if anybody wants to jump in the debate, but I believe we're through for today. So let me briefly, thank you all again for joining us. Once again, thank everybody for their presence, Professor David and everybody else. Our symposium will now take a break, but we will return in February for a second year. We have already confirmed lectures by several guests, and I hope to update the site in the next weeks with all the pertinent information. So everybody, thanks once more. Stay safe, have a great holiday, and we'll see each other again, hopefully in February. Bye-bye. Thank you very much, Professor. Very enlightening talk.
Let me thank you all for your questions, and it's very nice to be back in Brazil, even if remotely.
Yeah, we'll make sure to change that soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.